Hello, 11th and 12th grade. I forgot to set my timer, but I'm going to do that right now. Okay, we are starting today on number 112. That is our first note today, 112. We're still in chapter 27, but we're going to finish it today. In fact, we're going to finish it during this lecture. And then we'll move right on to the next chapter. So make sure you're doing your homework a little bit at a time so it doesn't get to the point where you feel like you're just being, swamped with homework. I don't want that. You know that. But let's get started right now. Number 112. Okay, we're going to talk about the Cold War. This is after World War II, and instead of an open conflict with armies in the field and shooting at each other and bombs dropping, instead the Cold War is going to be a conflict of ideologies. And the primary weapons and military personnel are going to be spies. Things are going to be done kind of slyly. They're going to be done sneakily. And mostly it's going to be done in rooms where people sit down and negotiate with each other. That doesn't mean it's going to be peaceable. But yeah, that is the Cold War. And this Cold War broke down to a conflict between the ideologies of Americanism, which honestly, that's what your book says. But if you said this in Europe, they would give you the stink eye because we're talking about Western ideology. Americanism does represent Western ideology, but the British were pretty big players in the Cold War, as were the now democratically chosen French and Germans. So for the purpose of your book and for the purpose of this course, which is U.S. history, we'll keep the Americanism because that's what we would recognize. But then there's also the ideologies of communism. So this is really going to be a war of ideas. And unfortunately, in the United States, we're going to see that conflict actually arising all throughout our nation because you're going to have people who still, even after all the proof that's out there about the problems in Germany with Nazism, fascism, socialism, all one thing there in Germany, and communism in Russia, there's still going to be people who want to push that on American soil. So let's talk about the difference between these two very basic ideas. Americanism sees the government as a protector of human life, private property, and the family. That protector issue is really huge. It's not about provision. The U.S. government, according to the Constitution, was not supposed to provide for its people. It was supposed to protect its people from enemies, both foreign and domestic. It wasn't supposed to be providing people with things. You have the right, you have the ability to provide for yourself. That's really how Americanism was supposed to be set up, was that it would give people the freedom and the ability to provide for themselves. That's what a free enterprise system is all about. It's having the freedom to create some kind of enterprise or work. Okay, communism views the government as the controller of people's lives. They tell everybody what to do, where to go, where they can eat, what they can eat, where they can live, how much they can charge for rent for people who are renting from them. And we see that a lot of this has crept into the US already. Communist countries are atheistic. They actually deny the existence of God, and they instead look at the state or the government as God. This state knows all, and it will punish you if you say anything against the state. So they deny the existence of God. They persecute those who believe in God. Okay, the Iron Curtain phrase, you may have heard it, maybe not. I don't know, because it's been a long while since we've talked about the Iron Curtain in the United States. This was a phrase that was coined by Winston Churchill. After World War II, when he finally left his position in Great Britain as the Prime Minister, he became quite famous as a speaker throughout the world. And one of the things he did, he spoke at a lot of graduation ceremonies in colleges and universities. And he talked about the Iron Curtain, this idea that this had fallen down, the Iron Curtain had been drawn, had been let down between Russia and its communist influence and the nations that it had taken over and the rest of Europe. So he said it's the idea that communist slavery had descended on the people of Eastern Europe. The Soviet states openly claimed that their goal was to conquer the world. Is it really that shocking? I mean, socialism, communism, fascism, they all have that impact. They all have that idea. They all have that plan. They want to take over the world. Why? Because it's a failure of a plan. And until they are able to force everybody to follow that plan, they are not successful. It's that simple. And even after they force everybody to follow their plan, they're still not going to be successful. But there's always that hope that someday they will figure it out. Not for me. I don't have that hope. Okay. Many who openly disagreed with communism were sent to slave labor camps. This is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He's in like all of your history books every year. He actually wrote a letter to a friend and said he didn't really agree with a specific thing that was being said by Stalin. And that was discovered, and he was sent to a labor camp for many, many years. And when he got out, he wrote about his experiences in the labor camps called gulags. And he was able to do some writing in Russia and get published, but they got to the point where they said, you can't be here anymore, and they kicked him out of Russia, fortunately for him. And then he discovered that they were getting ready to find his like notes on the slave labor camps, and they were going to somehow remove those from him. Spy networks were big at this time. So he realized he didn't have time to actually put everything in order and edit everything down. He just basically put all of the manuscript together and gave it to a publisher and said, publish it right now or else it's never going to be published. So if you read the Gulag Archipelago, it's interesting, but it's not very organized, and he's very repetitive. But he does give some really interesting insight about what it was like to live in a gulag. It wasn't pleasant. Okay, ordinary people could own very little private property, and they needed the government's permission for practically everything. Everything. And yet there are a lot of people in the United States who really want this. They want the government to tell them every single thing that they are allowed to do. I think there's a disconnect in people's brains where they assume that they're going to be able to continue to do everything, but the government's going to tell everybody else what to do to make their lives better. And that's just not how it works. Okay. This is what ended up happening in Russia, and they kept it quiet for a lot of years until a U.S. spy plane actually took some pictures from the air, and they saw that there was a lot of deserted area where there should have been crops, and from that they were able to glean that there was actually a famine going on. And then later on, pictures came out that weren't taken from U.S. planes; they came out from the Russians. The Russians had been forced to work on collectives. That means the government told them where to go, and they were going to be taken from cities, many of them. You're going to go out into the fields and you're going to start planting crops. Well, these are people who have never been farmers in their lives. And the people who had their land taken from them so that crops could be planted, they're remaining behind. And they're like, okay, well, we know how to plant crops. And the government saying, we have it all listed out on a piece of paper. This is your assignment. This is what you're supposed to do. And the farmers would look at those assignments and go, that crop will not grow here. It's too cold. It's too warm. There's not enough water. They knew what would grow in their areas, but the government, of course, was God. And so it was all knowing. And so people ended up starving to death from these huge famines that were the result of collective farming. And honestly, you would think that when people heard about this later on, nobody would want collective farming. But just 2 years ago, there was a Man on the Street interview with a kid, a college student, wearing, the hammer and sickle shirt, like a print. Total, oh, good grief. But anyway, and he's the man on the street who was doing the interview said, I see you're wearing like communist paraphernalia there. He says, yeah, we need to bring back collective farming. I'm like, why would we want to fail? There's no reason for this. This is what happens with collective farming. You see people actually starving to death on farms. They weren't allowed to eat the crops that they were growing. There was barely any crop going anyway. And people did get arrested and executed for eating the dead, or maybe murdering people and selling their body for food. And that's what that picture in the middle is. These two people who are standing up were caught dealing in human flesh. People were starving and they were eating each other. And this is the evidence that was against them. It's body parts that remained after they had butchered. So only a small ruling class of communist leaders had any kind of privileges. They lived in the best places, they ate, they drank, they made merry on everybody else's work and money. The majority of the money that was made by the people in Russia was taken by the government and used for weapons. That was primarily it. But again, you see the same thing in every communist or socialist country. You're going to see the leaders living very, very well, and everybody else is basically their slaves. Oops, sorry, did twice. Now, the Truman Doctrine. After World War II, we had Harry Truman. He started during World War II and then was reelected. He pledged American help for any free nation that was threatened by communist takeover. And he was willing to put military into places that were being threatened by communist takeover. He says, we're going to do it. We're going to protect the world from communism. He could see it. He saw something that FDR refused to see. Even at the end, when FDR realized that Stalin was railroading him and he got angry at Stalin, he still wasn't strong enough, not physically, not mentally, to say communism, socialism is wrong. We've got to back away from this. I made a huge error. No, he's not going to do that at all. In fact, it's going to be really, it's going to be Truman who's going to be the first to say we're on the wrong path here. And he's really going to push this idea of wanting to protect other nations who are threatened by communist takeover. Unfortunately, there are going to be people who will rewrite history, and they will say that he didn't do that, but the next president did. And the next president was actually trying to prevent people who wanted to be communists to become communists. And it's like, that was never the American ideal, was to prevent people from adopting communism if they wanted it. It was to protect those who didn't want it. That was really the big issue, because communism requires a violent overthrow, and they didn't want people to have to go through that if they didn't have to. Okay. Let's see, I'm over here. There we go. Okay, George C. Marshall. He proposed the European Recovery Plan, and this was to prevent post-war poverty and unrest, because we had learned a lesson after World War I that poverty and unrest led to World War II. It's amazing how that works. So he realized also that the communists were exploiting that poverty and unrest. They were thinking, well, if people are angry enough, if people are hungry enough, they will believe our lies. They will believe that we will feed them and take care of them. People in Russia weren't being fed. They weren't being taken care of. But the communists were keeping that very, very secret from the rest of the world. In fact, there were a lot of celebrities, authors, musicians who were taking little trips to Russia, seeing what the Russian government wanted them to see, and then coming back and saying, Stalin is such a nice guy. He is wonderful. The people there love him. He is a great leader. We should all be communists. And then it comes out later that Stalin was a big mass murderer. So the communists were exploiting poverty and unrest. And so Marshall came up with an idea called the Marshall Plan. Americans gave billions of dollars worth of credit, food, and supplies to the people of Western Europe. America has always been incredibly generous with their money. People have reached into their own pockets. This isn't just tax money. This is donations that people have made. People have sacrificed to give money to other people to make sure that everybody is given a fair shake. Everybody is being fed. People in the United States tend to be very, very, very generous, especially in times of disaster. And yet the rest of the world seems to forget that. They accept our help when they need it, and then the rest of the time they badmouth us. It gets really frustrating. So the people of Western Europe were given supplies to rebuild their countries and get their economies going. Let me just talk about this real quick. In order to get the supplies to a lot of Western Europe, our military, who were still flying planes, our Air Force, were being the ones who were the ones that dropped all this food off. So they were still working overseas, even though the war was over. Okay, the Taft-Hartley Act back at home in 1947, this weakened the power of labor unions by outlawing the closed shops. These are union shops in which workers must join a union after being hired. So they don't have a choice. If they want to work someplace, they've gone through the interview process, they've been hired by the management, and they are told, you can work here. And then as soon as they walk in, they're told by the union, who has given absolutely nothing to this company or factory, they're told by the union reps, you are not allowed to work here unless you belong to the union, which means that they have to pay a fee to belong to the union. So a portion of the money they make has to go to that union. And then the union tells them when they're allowed to work. Okay? Now, they have a regular schedule, like always, but if the union decides that people aren't making enough money or if they're working too many hours, they can tell everybody, you're going on strike. We're going to go on strike and get you more money, which means that during the time of the strike, people don't make an income. They have to sacrifice their time. They have to be on a picket line. They have to sacrifice their own money that they may have saved up in order to try to get more money in the form of raises. They might get hours cut, as you know, they'll make more money that way. And then when it comes down to it, when everything's over, they may have more money, but then the union dues tend to go up as well. So they were permitted, let's see, union shops or clothes shops were permitted, but they could be outlawed within a state. So a state could say, we disagree with what the unions are doing, so we're going to make it illegal for there to be closed shops. We want the passage of right to work laws. That means you have the right to work without being in a union. Okay. It doesn't seem like a big deal today, but back in 1947, 57, 67, and 77, the unions were incredibly violent toward people who weren't unionized. So if someone wanted to work at a job and they didn't want to be in the union, sometimes the union people, the people who worked at that job, would go after them physically, like beat them up, pull out their teeth. Yes, that actually did happen. Throw bricks through windows of their houses. In other words, you can't work with us unless you become a union member, or we're going to terrorize you and your family until you join. That's not right. And so I'm really not a huge fan of unions today. I understand why they came about in the first place. I understand why in some corporations people felt the need still to have unions, but for the most part, I think unions are pretty corrupt for the most part. Not every union, but many of them. Okay, striking workers were required to go back to work if the president issued an injunction against a strike. In other words, if they said, we are not going to work because we want more pay, but that strike was a threat to the health and safety of the nation, the president could issue an injunction and say, no, you must go back to work. You have to go back to work, because if you don't, people are going to die or people are going to become very ill. There was an injunction early on in union life against the rail during the Pullman strike, because it was holding up the U.S. mail, and that was illegal. You weren't allowed to do that. Okay, so while running for re-election, Truman took his campaign to the people. It wasn't the first time a president or someone who was being elected, a candidate, did this, but this one was massively extensive. He traveled 31,000 miles and he gave 350 speeches across the country. He was the first candidate to campaign by going to the people in every part of the nation. Other candidates had gone by train and by car, talking to people, but he's the first one to go to every part of the nation and campaign. On Election Day, the Chicago Daily Tribune published an early edition bearing the headline, Dewey Defeats Truman, because Dewey was the man they had chosen to win, and they couldn't believe that Truman would win. This is still going on today. The press, the media is still predicting winners, and when the actual count comes in, they're shocked that they were, how could we have been wrong? There must have been something wrong. We couldn't possibly have been the wrong ones. It must have been the Russians must have colluded, or maybe there was some kind of issue with the count. Oh, there's no way we could have been that far off. Yeah, There is. If you are going in thinking we are backing one person and we are going to totally ignore everything the other person does and how popular they are, yeah, you're going to be shocked when your person doesn't win. Okay, so when the votes were actually counted, turns out Truman had won. And at the victory celebration, he held up the front page of the Chicago Tribune for all to see. Dewey defeats Truman. It's like, nope, didn't happen. You know what else didn't happen is when it was discovered that Truman beat Dewey, there weren't a bunch of Dewey fanatics standing outside screaming into the abyss and crying and throwing, trash cans through windows, because people were slightly more mature then than they are now. Okay, the Fair Deal. This is Truman's program to continue FDR's New Deal programs, but there's a problem with the New Deal programs. They were socialistic in nature, and Truman is going to continue those programs. He expanded the Social Security system, but he failed to pass the minimum wage requirement, which means that everybody in the United States has to pay their workers a minimum wage that's set by the government. Instead of someone looking at their shop and saying, I can afford to pay this much, and whoever wants to work for me for this much, they can interview with me and we'll come to an agreement. Instead, the government gets involved and says, no, you must pay your workers this much, but I can't afford that. So what ends up happening is that the person who's hiring doesn't hire and people don't get jobs. Or if you're already in business and you're paying everybody the minimum wage and the minimum wage goes up, generally speaking, somebody gets fired and all the prices go up. Happens every time. He also ended racial segregation in the armed forces. And for this, I can get behind him 100%. Go. Okay. This is really different for this party too, because they had always been the party of segregation. And this is the first time we're going to see a Democrat standing up and saying, no segregation. Okay, there were some troubles in Germany, however. After World War II, the Allies all split the land of Germany between them. And basically what their plan was is they were going to help Germany rebuild and to become a type of republic where they could vote for representatives and have a independent nation once again, but not with a socialist/fascist leader. So we had to rebuild and then have a decent government. So the city of Berlin, which is located in East Germany, was also divided into eastern and western sections, and those sections were actually run by the different allies. Now, 3 of those allies had representative government to the point where the people had a say. And then 1 of those allies did not. They were a communist government where only the government has a say. And so eventually the 3 from the western side of the allies basically merged together, and that became West Berlin. And that was Free Berlin, where the people of Berlin actually ran the city themselves. East Berlin was run by Russia, and the people were forced to live according to Russian law. Okay, which was communism. For over a year, from 48 to 49, Russia closed off the road between Eastern Germany to West Berlin, and that isolated West Berliners from the free world. So people in West Berlin who were supposed to have a free government were cut completely off, which means there's no trade and there's no way to get food in and out. There's no way to get medical supplies in and out. They were completely cut off on the road. So if you block the road, how else can you get in there? By air. So Operation Airlift began. The Western powers saved the people of West Berlin from starvation by flying in food and supplies. Russia eventually abandoned the blockade when they realized they could not win, but this was just a really smart, brilliant move on the part of Western Europe and the United States. The way they had it set up, the pilots were not allowed out of their planes. Everything had to move super, super fast. So the pilots, they would circle the airport until they were told they were allowed to land. They would go all the way to the end of the runway, stop their plane. A girl a German girl in a cart would come driving out to him, to the pilots, and say, "Hi, how you doing?" and converse with them while they ate a sandwich. She would bring sandwiches, coffee, tea, whatever, and they would talk, and he would eat. His co-pilot would eat everything. And while they were doing that, while they were socializing and he was eating a snack, the back end of the plane was actually being unloaded very quickly. And then as soon as it was unloaded, the girl in the cart said, "Goodbye. It was very nice talking to you." And she went back and the plane took off. This way, everything got done very, very, very quickly. Okay, I'm going to say one more thing about this and then we'll move on to the next thing. I just want to see what the next note was. There was one man in particular, and you've probably heard me talk about this before. One man in particular, he noticed that a lot of German children would stand near the airport and watch the planes as they went by, and he would wave his flaps at them. The flaps are what they use to slow the plane down. So he would wave the flaps, and they called him Uncle Wiggily, he found out. And one day he had his Hershey bar. Hershey's often gave chocolate to the military to give among to the soldiers. He had his Hershey bar in his pocket, and he took out his handkerchief, and he tied his handkerchief to the four corners of the Hershey bar. And when he went low, came in for his landing, he threw the Hershey bar out of the window from his cockpit. And the kids saw this parachute come down with a chocolate bar on it, and they were so excited. And so the next day he did it again. And then he got 2 Hershey bars, and then his friends found out what he was doing, and they gave him their Hershey bars and their handkerchiefs. And then he got to the point where he was buying like fabric and Hershey bars, and he was making these little parachutes for these kids. And his CO found out about it and got really angry. He says, "You were there to do a job. You were supposed to land your plane and get out as quickly as possible. You're not there to throw candy out of your plane." And he's like, "Oh, okay, sorry." So here he's got all these Hershey bars that have been donated to him. He's got all this fabric. He's like, "Oh, okay, and get some stuck with these." Right after that, the CO's commander came in and says, "Where's that guy who's throwing Hershey bars out the window?" And the guy's like, "Oh no, I just told him to stop." He goes and finds Uncle Wiggily, and he says, "You keep it up. You're doing a great job. This is exactly what those kids needed." And so after that, Hershey's started donating chocolate bars specifically so he could make little parachutes and throw them out the window. So if you want to look him up, he's all over the internet. You can find him. It's really interesting. It's just a simple act of kindness that meant the world to a lot of people. Okay, the Berlin Wall was built in 1961 by the communists because people in East Berlin who had been cut off from the freedom of West Berlin were constantly escaping into West Berlin. They lived under communism. They said, "Wow, this really stinks," and they left. So the communists built a wall to keep them in. This is the only time in history that a wall was built to keep people inside their own country rather than keep enemies out. That says something about communism. It's not good. And yet people today are using this idea. They're flirting with the idea that communism, maybe we could do it, the right way this time. Maybe, it would work for us if we just did X, Y, and Z. No, it doesn't work. It's never worked. It never will. Okay, the United Nations, another thing that will never work. Organized in 1945, it was invited to build its headquarters in New York City. Why do I say it would never work? Because it totally discounts human nature. The idea that people are going to backstab each other. It will happen, okay? The belief that we will not have any wars as long as people can sit down and talk is just fanciful. It's not realistic. It's not going to happen. So the United Nations built on the ruins of the League of Nations, which was supposed to get rid of war, and 20 years later, there's another world war. So the United Nations was invited to build its headquarters in New York City. That piece of land that building is on is not part of the United States. It is an international piece of land. It doesn't actually belong to the U.S., even though it's located within the United States, within New York City. 50 nations signed the UN Charter. Other nations joined later. Many people believe that a permanent world peace organization was essential for fear that nuclear war would destroy all human civilization. They want you to believe that because the UN exists, there is no more war, or there's fewer wars. There have been more wars since the United Nations has been developed than there were before World War II. There are wars all over this planet, and they've been going on for years and years and years. And the UN tries to step in and say, well, let's negotiate. It doesn't work. Okay, though the United States provides much of the financial aid to keep the UN going, it has very little say in what the UN does or how it's run. So we pay a lot of money, and they still want more. They, according to them, we're in debt to them. They always want a little bit more, and we are expected to give financial aid to other UN members. More than half of the UN member nations right now have a population smaller than New York City, but their votes count just as much as a major country like the United States. It's not going to affect them as much because they're so tiny. It's going to affect us a great deal because we're a much larger nation. Okay, when it comes to the UN, the United States bears the largest financial load to keep the UN operating. We put a lot of money into the UN every year. We also send the most troops whenever the UN is called upon to halt aggression in some part of the globe. Did you get that? The UN is supposed to prevent wars, and yet we send the most troops whenever it comes time to stop the wars. Why are the wars there in the first place if the UN is working? It's a problem. So the UN is called upon to halt aggression in some part of the globe, and it's mostly the US who sends soldiers to those places. Okay, since World War II, many nations in the UN have been decidedly anti-American. They don't like the Americans because the Americans actually have money. They follow a system of government that allows its people to vote freely. And a lot of countries do not like that because that means the people in charge will get voted out. So they hate the United States for presenting that idea of freedom. They also don't like the fact that we are primarily a capitalist society, which means that the individual people in the United States have the ability to gain great wealth. They don't want that. They want the country to be wealthy, not the individuals. Here's the thing, though. The United States is wealthy because its people are wealthy. Our poorest people are wealthier than most people in poverty around the globe. And people have the ability to work in the United States. Nothing's stopping them. Over years, communist countries have convinced many third world nations that communism is the answer to all the problems and that the United States is their enemy, despite the fact that the United States bails them out majority of the time. Communist countries tend to give them weapons and tell them to keep fighting for their so-called freedom so they can take over and make it a communist nation. Okay. In 1948, the Jewish community in Palestine, most of whom were Holocaust survivors from Europe, proclaimed the independent state of Israel as a haven for Jews around the world. Here's a little bit of Israeli history people don't like to talk about. The beginning of World War II, when Hitler made it basically illegal to be Jewish in Germany, and he told the people at first, pack up your stuff and go, leave. People packed up their stuff and started to leave. Then they discovered that as they were leaving, they had to go through inspections where all their stuff was taken from them. So they ended up with almost nothing as they left the country of Germany. They weren't allowed to take cars or planes or anything like that. They had to walk out. And then Hitler said, no, I'm not going to let you guys leave at all. In fact, he started using them as slave labor in concentration camps. After people were freed from concentration camps, they still had no place to go. Their homes had been destroyed. Many of them didn't want to live in Germany again. Why would you? If you had gone through what they had gone through. And they ended up being on ships that basically were floating like temporary housing. And then there were some areas, believe it or not, that were just refugee camps that looked a lot like internment camps or labor camps. People were living there for years, waiting for a chance to go to Israel. Because by 1948, Israel was a country, but they still had a limit on how many people they could accept in. not because the Israelis chose that, but the UN stepped in and said you can only have so many people of Jewish descent come in a year, so many people. So people waited for years sometimes to get into their new homeland of Israel. As soon as they became a nation, they were attacked from the outside and from the inside. As soon as they were made a country, people who before that time called themselves Jordanians or Libyans or Egyptians flooded into Israel and now call themselves Palestinians and said that they had been there first and they demanded a country of their own. Israel tried on 5 different occasions to give them piece of land for a Palestinian state. They agreed to a 2-state solution. Palestine, this new made up kind of country, each time said, no, we don't want it. We want all of it or nothing. We don't want the Jewish people here. Okay, so let's talk about NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was a military alliance established by several Western European nations, Canada, and the United States. And they committed to defend any NATO nation threatened by communist invasion. So anytime a communist invasion would come from the outside, NATO would spring into action and say, nope, no communism allowed to invade here. What it doesn't protect against is communist invasion from the inside. When college students who think they know everything try to take over voting and government offices specifically to present socialism and communism and try to take over the government from the inside that way. Okay, CETO was a Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and it was established by Eisenhower to defend Southeast Asia from communism. This is a little later than Eisenhower because LBJ is right there. Okay, so everybody have NATO and CETO? Well, good. Korea was divided into 2 zones, just like Berlin, the city of Berlin, had been divided between allies and between 2 allies. Same thing happened in Korea. In fact, it happened across the globe this way, where different allies would take over an area and try to get people back on their feet and rebuild their nation. So Korea was divided into 2 zones. The North Korea was overseen by the ally, the USSR, and the South Korea was overseen by the United States. The United States helped South Korea create a document that was a constitution. They helped them set up elections, and then they watched in dismay as the people of South Korea ended up hiring a president who was incredibly corrupt. And they're like, this isn't probably the best guy for you guys to choose. And they chose him anyway. And the United States said, well, he's your leader. You voted him in. In North Korea, however, the people who were being rebuilt. They're being rebuilt by Russia. And Russia's whole thing was, okay, you need to have an election, but you only get one person to run in the election, and it's going to be a guy from the Communist Party. And so they basically compelled the people of North Korea to be communist right from the very beginning. And then in their schools, the people of North Korea were being told that the people of South Korea had been captured by the United States, that the United States was imperialist, that they had captured that land and were making it their own colony. Didn't happen. And that the people of South Korea desperately needed to be saved by the people of North Korea. And so they got everybody very excited about going and freeing their relatives in South Korea in this Korean War. Okay, how do I know that about the schools? Because there was a guy who actually went to school and he says, when they got to South Korea and we're fighting, and I'm wondering why South Koreans are fighting us when we're there to rescue them. And then he discovered that a lot of what he was being taught was pure hogwash. It was nonsense. So in North Korea, the Soviet interfered with free elections. He saw that a communist government was set up, making it impossible to unify Korea into one nation. But North Korea had a plan, and Russia had a plan to unify it into one nation. They would just make South Korea communist by force as well. So they are going to cross that demarcation line, and they're going to try to compel all of Korean Peninsula to become communist. That's the whole goal. This is the man whose testimony I got that information about the school system from. In 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The UN sent troops, and most of them were, you remember, American, to help the South Koreans protect themselves against communist aggression. Now, the UN and our president were in agreement that they weren't trying to change North Korea from being communist. They just wanted to push the North Korean troops over that parallel and get them out of South Korea. You can't invade. That's not legal. So just go back up over your border. Yeah, that's not how communism works. They're going to fight tooth and nail to get past that border. But this is exactly what the people in South Korea are dealing with. They've got troops from the UN and the United States, and they're just trying to contain communism and not try to win the war or to stop communism altogether in this peninsula. So in the Korean War, General MacArthur headed UN forces. So he's the American general, but he's in charge of all the UN forces. The Chinese communists came to the aid of North Korea, and they sent in troops and supplies. Now let's go. I'm going to go back just for really quick. You can see how China shares quite a long border with North Korea, and they are getting supplies and ammunition from Russia, which is right at the very top. You see in the northeast, there's Russia, our US. So you've got Russia and China both helping North Korea, okay, primarily through China though. By this time, China was full-on communist government. So they were sending troops and supplies to North Korea. So MacArthur saying, okay, they can't win if they don't have a supply line. He wanted to bomb China's military bases and gain the victory in the Korean War because he's a general and he's looking at the war and saying, how do we win? Well, you cut the supply line, we can finish the war. We can finish it quickly and we can win. This is a man who knew what he was doing. He spent most of his career in the Far East, in the Pacific Theater. Remember, he had been in the Philippines. He became governor over Japan as it was going through its rebuilding. And now he is heading UN forces in Korea. So this is a guy who knows the culture. He knows the terrain. He knows the mindsets of both the communists and the nationalists. And he says, if we want to finish this quickly, we need to bomb China's military bases and gain that victory. And he was told by his president, his boss, no. President Truman feared offending communist China and the USSR, who were kind of pulling the strings. He ended up relieving General MacArthur from command because General MacArthur said, this is what we need to do to win. President Truman said, you're not allowed to do that. General MacArthur, using probably The Art of War, a famous book on war by Sun Tzu, who said, if you see a victory and you can have that victory, even if your sovereign says don't go anyway. You need that victory. So he went anyway, and he bombed, and he stopped that supply line, and then ended up getting trapped and had to be taken out, rescued, and that really ticked off the president, who is his commander-in-chief, and he said, "You're fired." And the people of the United States said, "What are you doing? How could you fire General MacArthur?" And Truman's like, he disobeyed orders. And everybody's looking at Truman and going, you were a hat maker. You sold clothes for a living before you got into politics. This is a guy who's been in the military most of his life. You were a haberdasher. Sold ties, hats, coats to men. That was his job before he got into politics. And he thinks he understands what he should do more than the commander of the UN. Okay, so it ended up extending the length of this war. In 1953, the armistice was reached. That means a ceasefire. But here was the result. Status quo antebellum. It went to the situation or the status that they were in before the war. Status quo antebellum. There was no winner. President Truman got his wish. They just pushed the communists back over the line and said, can we just agree that this is the border? And the people who fought for 3 years going, what are we doing here? The communists were like coming down and like murdering people on their farms. And yet we're just going to push them up and that's going to be the end of it. And it's like, yeah. Status quo antebellum. The same place we were in before the war. So Korea remained divided with a communist government in North Korea and a free government in South Korea. The war ended in a stalemate. I am only blocking the words Korea. Okay, so North Korea, South Korea. You guys can figure out how to spell Korea from all the other places I've written it on this slide. Okay. When General Douglas MacArthur came back to the United States in disgrace because he got fired by his commander-in-chief, even though he was hailed as a hero by the people who fought with him in World War II, he was invited to the Congress to speak to them. He had a lot of supporters in Congress, a lot. And his newspapers supported him. The American people supported him. The majority of people who didn't support him were the people who were right around the president. But he is famous for saying this: there is no substitute for victory. History teaches with unmistakable emphasis that appeasements but begets new and bloodier war. If you just try to make nice and you just try to give the bully something to leave you alone, they're just going to get more of a bully. It's just going to be a new and bloodier war. Don't do it. And that has rung true. The Korean War lasted for 3 years until a truce was signed. In that agreement, North Korea remained under communist control. South Korea remained free. Over 33,000 American soldiers died in defense of freedom during the Korean War. And if you ever want to watch a show that's, set during the Korean War, MASH was set during the Korean War. It went on for much longer than the Korean War did. It went on 3 times longer. It had 9 seasons. The Korean War had 3. But it's not a pro-war, or it's mostly an anti-war show. But they do a really great job explaining the necessity for medical personnel in the Korean War and how some of the stuff was just kind of ridiculous. Okay. So today, when we look at North Korea, which is still communist, when you look at it on a satellite map, this is the image you will see. You see the outline, okay, there. And then the part that's not outlined, that's part of the same peninsula, that is North Korea, where you just have the outline that's pretty much blank. And then South Korea is the part that's all lit up. You'll notice that the countries around North Korea are primarily lit up, with the exception of a lot of China is very dark. This is one of the biggest, best examples of the difference between communism and capitalism. In a capitalist nation like South Korea, you're going to have rich and poor, but for the most part, even the poor are going to be better off because at least they have access to electricity, plumbing, fresh water, okay, and the ability to get a job. In a communist nation, everybody's working, but nobody gets any benefit from it. The only people who get the benefit are the people who are in charge. And that's why the only really bright spot you see there is where the leader of South Korea actually lives. Okay, so that is it for this chapter. You did great. I'm going to take a quick break. You take a quick break. And when you're ready, you can get on to the next lecture because I'm going to start doing 2 a day now until we are done with the book. We are going to finish the book. So help me. We're going to finish this book and finish this class this year, but we are down to the very end. So make sure you're keeping up with your work. I'll talk to you a little bit later.